The boat left on a Tuesday morning with 7 people aboard and enough fuel for a 3-day crossing. It never arrived, not because it sank, not because it was destroyed by a storm, not because anything catastrophic happened in the first hours after it left the harbor. The boat landed. It landed safely, with all 7 people aboard in calm water, on a beach with fresh water nearby and enough vegetation to sustain them. It landed on the wrong island, and because of a chain of miscommunication so ordinary, so bureaucratically mundane, so completely devoid of drama that it almost defies belief, no one on the outside world would understand that these 7 people were missing for almost exactly 6 months. Not lost at sea, not presumed dead, not the subject of a search. Simply unaccounted for, in the gap between 2 systems that each assumed the other was responsible, in the silence between a harbor master who filed the wrong destination and a family who assumed no news was good news, an island chain administration so understaffed that a missing vessel report sat in a physical inbox for 11 weeks before anyone read it. 6 months. The world didn't know. The 7 people on that island knew exactly where they were. They just had no way to tell anyone. And what they did with those 6 months, what they built, what they decided, what they chose about how to live when civilization stopped watching, is the part of this story nobody has told properly. Let me tell you where this happened, because the geography is everything. The southwestern Pacific contains more than 25,000 islands. The majority are uninhabited. Many are charted but unmonitored, meaning they appear on maps, they have names, they are technically claimed by one nation or another, but no one lives on them and no administrative body checks them regularly. The specific island group relevant to the story sits within the outer archipelago of a Pacific island nation whose maritime administration covers an area of ocean roughly the size of Western Europe, with a staff that, in the relevant period, numbered fewer than 40 people. 40 people. Western Europe-sized ocean. Thousands of islands. The harbor master at the departure point was responsible for logging vessel destinations in a physical ledger and radioing a weekly summary to the regional maritime office. The week our 7 people departed, the harbor master logged their intended destination incorrectly. A transcription error. One island name written in place of another. 2 names that in the local language share the first 2 syllables. The regional maritime office received a weekly summary, filed it. No one cross-referenced it with arrival confirmations because arrival confirmations were not systematically collected. Vessels were logged leaving. Their arrival was assumed unless someone reported otherwise. No one reported otherwise because on the island where they were supposed to arrive, no one was expecting them specifically. They were not carrying cargo. They were not on an official itinerary. They were 7 people making a crossing that people made regularly, and their non-arrival was noted by perhaps 2 or 3 people who, when the boat didn't show, assumed the trip had been delayed or canceled. This is how people disappear without dying, not in storms, in paperwork. Now, let me tell you who the 7 people were. I am going to be careful here. The full account of this story, including names, was documented by a Pacific regional journalist whose reporting I have sourced for this video. Out of respect for people who survived something genuinely traumatic and have largely chosen to return to private life, I am going to refer to them by role rather than name. The group consisted of a boat captain in his late 40s who had made the crossing between these 2 islands dozens of times, his adult son, early 20s, who served as first mate, a woman in her mid-30s who was a teacher traveling to take up a post at a school on the destination island, 2 brothers, both teenagers, who were returning home after visiting relatives, a man in his 60s who was a retired government worker traveling to visit his daughter, and a young woman, 19 years old, who was making her first solo journey away from her home island. 7 people, 3 generations, no particular connection to each other beyond the boat. The crossing should have taken between 18 and 24 hours, depending on conditions. By hour 16, the captain understood they were off course. The storm that pushed them off course was not catastrophic. It was the kind of weather event that Pacific sailors navigate regularly, a fast-moving squall, significant wind and rain for 3 to 4 hours, rough enough to require all attention on the boat and navigation by instinct rather than instrument. The captain's GPS unit had been damaged by water ingress the previous month. He had been meaning to replace it. He had not yet replaced it. He navigated by stars and compass and his own accumulated knowledge of these waters. And when the squall cleared and he took his bearings, he was approximately 40 kilometers south of where he had intended to be. He corrected course. He ran through the early morning hours. And when land appeared on the horizon at first light, it appeared in roughly the right place, at roughly the right time, in roughly the right shape. He brought the boat into a lagoon on the western side of the island. The water was calm. The beach was clean. There was no settlement visible from the water. He assumed the settlement was on the other side of the island. This was not unusual. Many small Pacific islands had their single village on the eastern or northern shore, sheltered from prevailing weather. He anchored. They waited ashore. They made a fire and ate and slept because they had been awake for most of the night. When they walked across the island the next morning, there was no settlement. There was no settlement because this was not their island. The island they had landed on was approximately 11 kilometers long and 4 kilometers wide at its broadest point. It was listed on maritime charts. It had a name. It had been inhabited intermittently in the past. There were remnants of structures in the interior, foundations, the outline of what had been a garden or small plantation, but it had been uninhabited for more than 20 years. The nearest inhabited island was approximately 60 kilometers to the northeast, visible on clear days as a faint line on the horizon, present enough to orient by, far enough to be completely unreachable by swimming and nearly unreachable by their boat. I say nearly because the boat was still functional. They could have left. In the first days, the question of leaving was a central debate that occupied every conversation. The captain wanted to leave immediately and sail northeast toward the visible island. His son agreed. The teacher argued against it. The storm that had displaced them had come from the northeast. The weather was unsettled. The boat had already proven navigable in bad conditions, but not invulnerable. If they left in uncertain weather and something happened to boat, engine failure, another squall, they would be in open water with no land and no anchor point. The two teenage brothers were divided. The retired government worker was quiet. He had seen enough in his career to understand that the worst decisions were usually the ones made fastest. The 19-year-old said something that, according to the account documented by the journalist who later interviewed the group, ended the first debate and set the tone for everything that followed. She said, "We have water and land and the boat. If we leave and we are wrong, we have nothing. If we stay and someone comes, we have everything we need to be found. And if no one comes for 2 weeks, we leave with more information than we have now." She was 19 years old. She had never made a solo journey before. They stayed. 2 weeks became 4 became 8. 8 became the quiet, terrible understanding that whatever had been expected of them on the outside world had been resolved without them, that people had moved on, adjusted, that the gap their absence created had been filled in by the ordinary adaptation of daily life. The teacher's school had presumably found another teacher. The teenage brother's family had presumably what? Grieved? Accepted? Continued? The captain understood, somewhere around week 10, that they were not being searched for. His understanding of Pacific Maritime Administration was professional and precise. If a search had been mounted, it would have reached this island or passed close enough to it to see smoke within the first 3 weeks. They had maintained a signal fire on the highest point of the island from day 4 onward. No one had come. He didn't tell the others his conclusion immediately. He thought about it for 4 days, and then he told them, calmly and directly, because he felt they had a right to know what the silence meant. That night was the hardest night. I won't pretend I can describe what that conversation was, or what the hours after it felt like for 7 people on an uninhabited island in the middle of the Pacific who had just accepted that the world had lost them. I can tell you that the next morning, the 19-year-old was the first one up. She had already rebuilt the fire and was boiling water when the others woke. She had been awake most of the night. She had made a decision about what the day was going to be. Here is what 6 months on an uninhabited Pacific island actually looks like, assembled from the group's testimony. The first 2 weeks were crisis mode. Fresh water located. Food sources inventoried. Shelter improved using materials from the boat and structural remnants from the abandoned settlement. Signal fire established and maintained on rotation. Weeks 3 through 6 were the adjustment period. The emotional weight of the situation settled in. Sleep patterns disrupted. Appetite inconsistent. Interpersonal tension. Inevitable when 7 strangers share 30 square meters of daily living space with no privacy and no exit. The retired government worker became unexpectedly essential during this period. He had spent decades managing people in difficult bureaucratic circumstances, which is to say, he had spent decades navigating rooms full of people who were frustrated and scared and taking out on each other. He knew how to de-escalate. He knew how to create small structures that gave people a sense of agency when the larger situation was completely outside their control. He organized a work rotation. Specific tasks, specific people, specific times. It sounds trivial. It was not trivial. Having a job to do, a real job, a job that mattered to the group's survival, gave each person a reason to be productive each morning, which gave each person a reason to get up, which is in long-term isolation, not as automatic as it sounds. The 2 teenage brothers took on the fishing and became exceptional at it. The teacher took inventory of the island's plant resources and identified which were edible, which had medicinal properties she was aware of, and which should be avoided. The captain and his son maintained the boat and conducted regular short reconnaissance trips around the island's perimeter, close enough to return safely, far enough to watch for passing vessels. The 19-year-old kept a record. The record she kept is a document that, when the group was eventually found and the story was eventually told, became the primary source for understanding what those 6 months actually contained. She used the back pages of a notebook she had brought for the journey. She had been planning to write letters, she said later, to her family, describing what she saw on her first solo trip. Instead, she wrote something else. She wrote daily. She wrote what happened, what was decided, what was eaten, what was discussed, what the weather did, what the horizon looked like, what she thought about at night when she couldn't sleep. She wrote about the other 6 people with the specific, unsentimental attention of someone who has no one else to observe and has run out of other things to think about. She noted when the retired government worker made someone laugh, and when the captain went silent, and what the 2 brothers talked about when they didn't know she was listening. She wrote about what she missed, and what she didn't miss, and what she had decided she was going to do differently when she got back. She wrote about the day in week 14 when the teacher found a particular plant she recognized from childhood, a plant her grandmother had used to make a specific preparation for her headaches, and how the teacher had sat with the plant for a long time without picking it. And when the 19-year-old asked her why, she said, "Because my grandmother is gone, and I thought this was gone too, and finding it here feels like something I don't have a word for." She wrote it all down, because someone had to. They were found on the 173rd day, not by a search party, not by a rescue mission, not by any organized effort, by a fishing boat from a neighboring island whose captain had decided on that particular morning to try a stretch of water he didn't usually fish, because his usual grounds had been unproductive for 2 weeks, because he was trying something different. He saw smoke from the signal fire. He altered course. He came into the lagoon. He found 7 people who were thin and weathered and entirely composed, because by day 173, the range of possible outcomes had been accepted so completely that a fishing boat arriving felt less like a miracle and more like a conclusion. The captain of the stranded vessel met the fishing boat captain at the water's edge. They spoke briefly. The fishing boat captain later told the journalist who covered the story that the first thing the stranded captain said to him was not "help us" or "thank you" or "we've been here 6 months." It was, "Do you have any coffee?" The official accounting of how 7 people went unrecorded for 6 months took considerably longer than 6 months to complete. The harbor master's transcription error was identified. The regional maritime office's filing backlog was documented. The missing vessel report had been received, physically, 11 weeks after the departure, and had sat unread for a further 3 weeks before someone processed it. By that point, more than 3 months had passed. The report was cross-referenced with departure logs. A discrepancy was identified, and an inquiry was opened. The inquiry was still open when the fishing boat found them. The administrative review that followed identified 17 separate points in the reporting and communication chain where the error could have been caught and wasn't. Not because people were negligent. Exactly. Because the system assumed a baseline of functionality that didn't exist. It assumed arrival confirmations that weren't collected. It assumed filing timelines that weren't met. It assumed cross-referencing that no one had time to do. 40 people. Western Europe-sized ocean. 17 points of failure. Changes were made. Digital logging was introduced. Arrival confirmation protocols were formalized. The regional maritime office received additional staffing. It took a specific disaster to produce specific reforms. It usually does. The 7 people went home. The teacher was 3 terms late to her posting. The school had indeed found replacement, who stayed. She found another position. The teenage brothers came home to a family who had, as the captain had suspected, resolved their absence into something they could live with. The reunion was, by the account of the journalist, who was present for parts of it, not what any of them expected. Less explosion, more slow re-entry. Like coming back to a room where the furniture has been rearranged while you were gone. Same room, different configuration. The retired government worker visited his daughter, which was what the journey had been for in the first place. He was 6 months late. She had been waiting. The captain and his son repaired the boat properly, new GPS, new weather radio, and went back to making crossings. The captain was asked by the journalist whether he had any hesitation about returning to the water. He looked at the question for a moment and then said no. The water hadn't done anything wrong. The 19-year-old went home and, some months later, submitted a piece of writing to a regional literary publication. It was drawn from the notebook. The publication ran it across 2 issues. It was the first thing she ever published. It was not the last. I want to tell you what I keep thinking about with this story. It is not the survival. 7 people with land, fresh water, a functional boat, and collective knowledge survived 6 months on an uninhabited island. That is remarkable, but it is not inexplicable. Humans are good at this when they have the basic inputs. We underestimate how good. What I keep thinking about is the gap. The gap between a harbor master writing 1 syllable wrong in a ledger and 7 people spending 6 months on the wrong island. That gap is not dramatic. It is not the result of malice or negligence or any single person's failure. It is the result of a system that was designed for a world slightly more functional than the world it actually operated in. Every assumption the system made was reasonable. Arrivals are usually confirmed informally. Reports are usually read within a few weeks. Cross-referencing usually catches errors. Usually, mostly, in normal circumstances. These were normal circumstances. That was the problem. No storm, no emergency, no obvious crisis to trigger the system's exception protocols. Just 7 people in a gap between reasonable assumptions, invisible because nothing about their disappearance looked like a disappearance. And the 17 points where it could have been caught. Every single one of them was a moment where a human being made a reasonable decision based on incomplete information and moved on to the next thing. That is how people disappear. Not in catastrophes. In the ordinary operation of systems that almost work. The notebook exists. The journalist who broke the story has seen it. The 19-year-old, who is now in her late 20s, building what sounds like a genuinely good life, has not published it in full. She said in one interview that she might someday, that there are parts of it she's not ready for other people to read yet. Not because they're dramatic, because they're private in a way that 6 months of documentation becomes private when you realize you were writing it for yourself without knowing it. 173 days of a person being completely honest with herself because she had no reason not to be. I understand why she's keeping it. I hope someday she decides we're ready for it. Because somewhere in those pages, in the handwriting of a 19-year-old on an island nobody knew she was on, is an answer to the question that this story keeps asking. What do you become when the world stops watching? She wrote it down. We just haven't been allowed to read it yet.